Talking today about the history of the English language. English is considered one of the toughest languages in the world to learn. Only Chinese languages and Indian languages, like from India, are considered tougher to learn. One of the reasons why English is difficult to learn is its unusual history. It was a merger of two very different languages that merged beginning in the famous year 1066. And because of this merger, there's a lot of inconsistencies in English, inconsistent spellings, and all sorts of irregular verbs and exceptions to what you think would be the rule. So, tough language to learn, and here is why. So, English, as we know it, can be divided into three pretty distinct periods. Old English, also known as Anglo-Saxon, which is from the beginnings, roughly 400-500 AD, to 1066. Then from 1066 to about 1600, Middle English, and then from 1600 to the present, Modern English. In the early period, this comes from tribes from the east of England, Anglo-Saxon tribes that migrated to the island after the Romans retreated, when the Roman Empire began to shrink. So the Angles and the Saxons, and England, the name England was originally Angle land. And the first reference to that is around 800 AD, like Anglelanda. They probably would have pronounced it. So Angleland and England is where we get the name from, and that's where our language comes from. If you could go back in time before 1066, you would barely understand anything they said, although it's technically English. It's from England. You could understand 5%, and I'm going to say 10% at the most of what they said. They had a written language, but very different from ours now. They used what we call runes, and take a look. Here are some runes. The most famous rune is the thorn. It's the third one on the top row. That's the TH sound, and many languages don't have that sound, the th sound. And there you go. So we have poems and written works. Beowulf, the most famous, from the Old English period, but the language was very different and pronounced very differently from how it is now. So you would be lucky to understand even 10%. 1066 is the most famous date in the language, and this is the famous Norman invasion. The Normans were another tribe, and they came from northern France, and they sailed across the English Channel with their boats and their spears and bows and arrows, and they fought a few battles, and they conquered the Angles and the Saxons. So this is the beginning of really England as we know it now, like the nation as we know it now, because it's the beginning of the monarchy. They still have the monarchy now, like the Queen of England, as I'm recording this video, Queen Elizabeth II. If you go far back enough in any nation's history, this is what you get. You'll get colonialism or some kind of a conquest. So in English history, it's 1066. For our purposes, we're talking about the language. So we know already the native, or if they even count as native people there, Anglos and Saxons spoke Old English, but the Normans spoke Old French, and Old French came from Latin, which is what the Romans spoke, and these two languages were very, very different. So this is the main reason why English is so strange. It's the merging of these two languages. They merged during this middle period here, Middle English, and during this period there's an invention. If you think for a moment, what was invented that has to do with language during this period, this time period here? The printing press. And had the printing press been invented a little later, some of the inconsistent spellings might have been straightened out in the meantime. But as it was, the printed press made permanent some of these odd spellings, although people still spelled things any old way for hundreds of years. But the printing press is a little bit ironically responsible for some of the inconsistencies, at least in how the language is spelled. Let's see. So Middle English, if you could go to the middle of that period, like if you're there in the 1300s, the most famous writer is Chaucer, you could understand some stuff of what people are saying, probably about a third, maybe half. Even that's not great, but you'll basically start understanding it. Generally, the simpler words are the ones that go back to Old English and the ones that we still use today and that you could understand. Words like stool, right? So simple words. Door, simple everyday words are the same. So I'm going to try to keep the video fairly short, and then we're going to get ahead now to the 1600s. It's really a little earlier than that. You could go back to 1500, and then you'll understand most of what people are saying. 1600 is an easy date to remember. Also, it's when Shakespeare was writing. So Shakespeare is the useful marker for the beginning of modern English. And in fact, Shakespeare invented various words and phrases that we use today. The most famous of those is love affair, from one of Shakespeare's plays. So this is when now those two languages have merged and have taken a somewhat permanent form, although language always evolves, into modern English starting around 1600. A couple other things that I'll get into this short video here. There were still inconsistent spellings, inconsistent capitalization, people still doing what they wanted, like any word that they thought was important, they might capitalize. And it wasn't until the 1750s, where we get the first real dictionary. There were some attempts before this, but what we consider the first real dictionary, written by Samuel Johnson, and there are still copies of that one around. Wouldn't that be neat to own? A couple other things. English is supposedly the most word-heavy language in the world. There's the most words of any language is English. I don't know how they figured that out, but the linguists tell us there's more words in English than any other language. So even when you're like me, and this is your job, is teaching English and reading old stuff pretty often, you will still come across words that you've never seen before and you don't know what they mean through your whole life. So I still find them. So that's why, if you're wondering, what does that word mean? Well, awful lot of words in English is why. However, there's a neat advantage to that, which is that you can always find the perfect word for what you need. There'll be many different semi-synonyms to describe some particular thing. So if you want to be a writer, literature, poetry, English is a great language for that. And in fact, English literature and poetry is usually considered the best in the world. They're not the best artists, not the best cooks, not the best at a lot of things. But the English are considered the greatest writers and poets. And part of that is because of the advantage they have with the language that they use.